Hi, welcome. I'm Hannah. This is Theology Therapist. And today I wanted to talk to you about something that I don't hear talked about all that often, but I have had come up quite a bit with my clients. So here we go. Are you somebody who has heard people talk about trauma and it kind of resonates with you, but it didn't actually happen to you? So have you had a close friend or a relative who has experienced a traumatic event? Yes? Have they talked to you about it? Would you believe me if I told you that you can actually develop PTSD from someone else's trauma? All right, we're gonna throw up here the first criteria for PTSD in the DSM, which is the manual for diagnosing. So criterion A says that in order to be diagnosed with PTSD, a person has to be exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence in the following ways: direct exposure, witnessing the trauma, learning that a relative or close friend was exposed to a trauma, or indirect exposure to aversive details of the trauma, usually in the course of professional duties like first responders and medics. Okay, so let's talk about this. First, let's start with indirect exposure due to professional duties. So this would be first responders, nurses, police officers, firefighters, medics. These are all people who are exposed to traumatic incidents regularly due to the nature of their jobs. And witnessing these things regularly can cause a traumatic reaction in the person witnessing it. So even if it's not the person who it's happened to, if you are like witnessing it or hearing about the events, you're a therapist who works with trauma a lot, if you are a nurse or a doctor, right? And you are hearing about the details of a traumatic event that has happened to someone else, that exposure to those details repeatedly can cause that PTSD reaction. So the tough part here with, I would say, like the first responder category is that I think what you tend to see is a type of disassociation, numbing out, and apathy, right? Like this, you get like compassion fatigue is another word we have for it, or burnout, right? Like those are all things that we have for that, and can stem from the overload, the intense influx of information you're receiving about traumatic things. Okay, but what if you're not a first responder? You're just like an average Joe or an average Jane, right? And what if that still resonates with you? You're like, okay, I feel like I've heard people talk a lot about trauma and it totally resonates with me, but it didn't happen to me. This is a thing that I think that we don't talk about a lot, or there's not a lot about this. But learning about a close friend or relative being exposed to a traumatic event is criteria for criteria for PTSD potentially developing, and it can actually cause the same symptoms in you. This usually happens depending on how the information was relayed to you, how much information was given to you, and like maybe the state of the friend or relative whenever they were telling you about this. So if it's something that they've like maybe processed and they've gone through and it comes out in a conversation that you guys have, I imagine that it's going to be like troubling, upset. It's like not going to be a happy thing that you're like talking about, but you see them in their like sort of okay presentation, in their okay like state. Whereas if your friend or your relative is talking to you about these things and seems like visibly upset, if there's a lot of like emotional upheaval there and really having difficulty coping with what has happened, then that is when this is going to make this difficult for you to cope with what has happened to them. It may also depend on your age at when you learned of this thing happening to your friend or relative. If you are an adult, and depending on how your friend or relative presents, PTSD reaction may or may not happen or develop. And it's not to say that it won't or can't, but as an adult, you have more like language and brain development and functions at your disposal. Whereas if this happens when you are a kid, you have less brain development and less language at your disposal. Also, what happens as if you learn of this as a kid, kids, as we all know, they are naturally sort of like selfish beings and think that the world revolves around them because when you're really young, it does, you know? And they're not selfish as in like they're, you know, mean little creatures or like whatever, narcissistic little creatures, but they're just kids. When you're in that state of mind, it is a lot more likely that the learning of this happening is going to feel personal. Like it might feel like in some way it's your fault, or depending on how the message is conveyed. So depending on like what's conveyed to you about what happened to your friend or family member, then the feeling of guilt or blame, it can, like, that would change, right? And that's another thing that can happen, is that whether intentionally or unintentionally, there might be messages, implicit or explicit, that are conveyed when this information is relayed. So something like, why are you so sad? You haven't gone through what I've gone through. Or if I could only have it as good as you, you know, like those kinds of things. And those kinds of things they don't feel good. They're completely invalidating, whether you are a kid or an adult. That invalidation, if that is what's happening, can lead to excessive or inappropriate feelings of guilt or blame, and can have a hard time feeling a sense of esteem about yourself, so having self-esteem. If you're a first responder, this may happen due to messages that you've heard and believe about your ability to save or to help people, right? Like wanting to rightfully or understandably wanting to be able to do that for everyone or for the people that you meet, and not being possible. If this happened to a close friend or a relative, this may create a type of survivor's guilt, or a sense that like you could feel better if you would just change how you're currently feeling. Like you didn't experience the traumatic event, so just change it, just feel different, you know, like just stop being sad or just stop being anxious because you have nothing to be anxious about. Like it can create this feeling of like, it's kind of just invalidating, right? Like you can just change it, just do it. Like what's wrong with you? Like there's nothing wrong with you. And I guess the biggest thing is that it is really hard to get help or to ask for help if this has happened to you, because it didn't happen to you, and because of these potentially invalidating messages that you might have received. So please know that if you're feeling trauma symptoms because of a trauma that you've learned about to a close friend or family member, that trauma therapy can help. It can help you process what you learned, understand why this happened, validate, keyword here, validate your experience, and improve your self-confidence. If this is you and you are in Massachusetts, check the link in the description to schedule a free 15-minute consultation to see how therapy can help. If you're not in Massachusetts, make sure that you subscribe to the channel so that you get a notification when next week's video comes out, because we often talk about lots of different aspects of trauma that you may or may not know about. So make sure before you go to hit that red subscribe button, leave me a comment to let me know if you've heard about this before or what you think, and I will see you next week. Be well.